Oh, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to be in Manchester. I have to say, my favourite city, I think. And I speak as somebody who's lived in Newcastle for a quarter of a century, so that's quite an admission. I'm going to talk about Edgar Allan Poe, and this is the essay that I wrote about him for the book, edited, but slightly loosened up to make it more listenable, I guess. So I'm going to start with a quotation from Poe's essay on one of his contemporaries, Nathaniel Hawthorne. He's writing about Hawthorne's twice-told tales. In one sense, and in great measure, to be peculiar is to be original, and than the true originality there is no higher literary virtue. This true or commendable originality, however, implies not the uniform, but the continuous peculiarity, a peculiarity springing from ever-active vigour of fancy, better still, if from an ever-present force of imagination, giving its own hue, its own character to everything it touches, and especially self-impelled to touch everything. Now, Poe was inclined as a critic to be categorical in his remarks, as he shows in this extract from his essay on Hawthorne, and he goes on to use a limiting judgment on Hawthorne's stories as an opportunity to promulgate the general truth of an artistic principle which clearly derived from Poe's own practice and circumstances. T.S. Eliot was later to do the same thing, and by doing so create an authority which Poe, unfortunately, did not live to enjoy. Quite accidentally yesterday, and this is a rather Chekhovian coincidence, I was in Cheltenham having done a completely disastrous event about a book of railway poetry, and I was licking my wounds at the breakfast table in the hotel when I ran into a friend of mine who is writing a biography of Eliot's. And we happened to end up talking about the city of St. Louis for some reason. And he said that when Eliot was a boy in St. Louis and had to go to the dentist, which he had to go to very frequently in those early primitive days of dentistry when it was all a great deal of waiting and a great deal of pain, the only material he had at his disposal for reading, rather than copies of Hello or Country Life, was the collected works of Edgar Allan Poe. Now, reading this while expecting any minute to be put to the sword by the dentist would surely have had some effect on Eliot's sensibility, some refinement, some darkening of the sun, perhaps. Anyway, Poe's peremptory impatience with most of his contemporaries may have been a matter of temperament, but it also reflects the permanently embattled conditions of a life and career that almost make the plight of his admirer Baudelaire seem mild. Poe struggled to serve two masters, the betterment of American literature, in which he succeeded, and the need to make a living, in which he died still trying, beset on the one hand by alcoholism, which was exacerbated by his sense of family responsibility, and on the other by the hostility of the largely mediocre establishments of which he opposed himself. The need to work and the yet more powerful need to serve a distinctive literary vision were tasks for which he was both heroically ready and physically unfitted. The extremity of his vision and the economy he advocated and sought to perfect are, by a sombre irony, wholly apt to the conditions in which he had to operate. He remained and evolved as an artist where most others would have been reduced to the status of hacks, while the art itself often embodies the desperation of that imaginative insomnia endured in one of Piranesi's imaginary prisons. Poe's characters often live in a condition of intolerable hyperconsciousness. If the fact that Poe was preeminently a writer of tales, a miniaturist who perfected a certain kind of short story, the tale of obsession, makes perfect sense in terms of his life, what makes his fiction particularly interesting, given his gifts of compression, is that it seems far superior to his poetry. Atmospheric and accomplished as the poems are, they remain in thrall to a kind of romanticism whose day was almost past when Poe was writing. They lack the intensity and energy of the tales, though both forms are intended to fit Poe's insistence that the best works are those that could be read at a single sitting and in which the unity of a single completed effect could be discerned. In the stories, brevity itself becomes a kind of prosody, replacing the layer of formality given in poetry by rhyme, meter, and stanza. When Poe moves on to consider the shortcomings of other American contemporaries, he praises Washington Irving's Tales of a Traveler, but with this serious reservation. In many of the stories, the interest is subdivided and frittered away, and their conclusions are insufficiently climactic. In their various ways, some of Poe's most famous tales, The Telltale Heart, The Cask of Amontillado, The Fall of the House of Usher, or The Facts in the case of Monsieur Valdemar, for example, seem to consist almost entirely of climax. A relatively unsuccessful story, The Oval Mirror, usefully exhibits this tendency to an almost mechanical degree. I'm not sure if many people actually bother to read this one, but it's interesting as a kind of a way of viewing Poe. The narrator breaks into a lonely castle and in the bedchamber spends the night in contemplation of a compellingly lifelike portrait of a young woman. His perusal of a convenient catalogue of the paintings in the castle reveals that the young woman died during the cruelly extended sitting the painter required to perfect his work. The Oval Mirror thus seems to reveal an imaginative algorithm without convincing us that there is much at stake or persuading us of the reality of this particular young woman to whom we have scarcely been introduced. Poe's work is, of course, full of more successful depictions of beautiful dead, near-dead, or undead women. But even in its failure, The Oval Mirror, in particular, looks forward to Wilde's Dorian Gray, sideways at Robert Browning's My Last Duchess, and forward again to The Red Shoes and The Collector, all of which substantiate some of the possibilities sketched by Poe, while for the most part permitting themselves a more extended treatment of the theme. The Oval Mirror, as a story, recalls a description of some of the poet Byron's work as seeming to be written while dressing for dinner, though dinner was not always easy for Poe himself to come by. For the stories that do triumphantly succeed, it is first of all important that the reader is persuaded that for the duration, that the story world is the world's entirety, that there is nowhere else to be, that the tale's milieu are not variations on a recoverable norm, but are all that is and has ever been the case, miniature worlds as constrained as the teeming, overheated brain itself, which can no longer distinguish inner from outer phenomena. Poe's claustrophobia is imperious in his phrase, self-compelled to touch everything. And there are few writers who can match his power to immediately generate a sense of context. For example, The Black Cat, first couple of sentences. For this most wild yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad I am not, and very surely I do not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburden my soul. Who could resist reading on? Or, from the amazingly gruesome and relishing revenge tale, The Cask of Amontillado. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. Or, thirdly, The Telltale Heart. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. In each case, the teller exerts the same inescapable control as Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, though in Poe's case there is for the reader the additional uncomfortable sensation of the story having been phantasmally in progress for some time before we become aware of it. As readers, we are somehow complicit as citizens of the fictive worlds from which these narrators reach out as in familiar address. They are confident that we will understand what they disclose and recognize the logic they command or have at some time commanded. These methods reflect Poe's own insistence in his essay, The Philosophy of Composition, written in 1846, that it is only with the denouement constantly in view that we can give a plot its indispensable air of consequence or causation by making the incidents, and especially the tone at all points, tend to the development of the intention. Tone is a word long indispensable to the criticism of poetry, and one also important to Henry James's attempts to assure the status of fiction as art. And with tone goes another of Poe's articles of faith, the importance of effect, with all it implies about formal unity. Once we are privy to the meticulous reasoning of the madhouse, from then on it is all lurid intensity, often sustained by Poe's manipulation of the presiding past tense to make events and sensations suffocatingly present, and at the same time to prove them sealed against escape. The stories often read like traps in themselves. Poe is undeniably an acute observer and dramatist of abnormal psychological states, and this is an important reason why we read him. But this power does not entirely account for the sense of exposure and confinement that the stories create in the reader. That this should be so depends to a significant degree on things largely absent from the worlds Poe creates: work, family, and ordinary life among them, though these were things that in life he tried desperately to sustain. Compare a later masterpiece of the tale of terror, one that involves the supernatural as Poe usually does not. I refer to Elizabeth Bowen's wonderful story, The Demon Lover, published in 1947. Bowen's story requires an everyday world of bourgeois comfort and sobriety, admittedly one made strange by the Second World War, from which the mild, decent, middle-aged heroine is to be dislodged and finally snatched away by the figure in the title as he rises from the graveyard of the First World War into the innocent here and now. For Poe, by contrast, there seems to be no such place as the everyday. This can be illustrated by a relatively untypical story, The Man of the Crowd. Again, I suspect one that doesn't get read all that much, but it's particularly interesting, I would suggest. Here the narrator, idly amusing himself in town, is struck by the appearance and conduct of an old man. The stranger wears an expression of absolute idiosyncrasy, which brings to mind ideas of vast mental power, of caution, of penuriousness, of avarice, of coolness, of malice, of bloodthirstiness, of triumph, of merriment, of excessive terror, of intense, of extreme despair. I felt singularly aroused, startled, fascinated. Then came a craving desire to keep the man in view, to know more of him. The narrator follows the old man all night in his wanderings in the city. It turns out that the sinister flaneur suffers from a form of the problem diagnosed by Pascal as the inability to sit quietly in one's room. The old man cannot bear to be alone, but is the more emphatically alone because of his insatiable appetite for the illusory company of the various crowds who pass through the city. This is a genuinely modern story, describing the city as Baudelaire knew it, with its vast crowds wandering through desolation. Such is the story's modernity that Poe avoids the over-mechanical performance that mars the oval mirror. We know that the narrator is, albeit unwittingly, himself becoming a member of the demonic old man's tribe of restless solitaries, another glutton of the crowd. But he is not the same as the old man, for no one is the same as anyone else, and the narrator's own observations of types, classes, and professions tend paradoxically to emphasize this by invoking a mass anonymity. In The Man of the Crowd, the mere activity of walking becomes a deranged and endless ritual, a mapping of anxiety through an inescapable labyrinth of its own devising, in the place where religion would at one time have been found. Ritual, produced by obsession, is often at the core of Poe's stories. The walling up of Fortunato in the Cask of Amontillado is more than an action. It is a performance whose victim is also to be its audience. In this, Poe contributes crucially to the idea of the killer as a kind of aesthetic aristocrat of torment, most famously embodied in the character of Hannibal Lecter, and thereafter exploited to exhaustion in innumerable books and films about serial killers whose cellars and tunnels are the stages for, as they say, immersive site-specific dramas. The torments of the narrator in The Pit and the Pendulum partake of a ritual character deriving from the sacrificial ideology of Catholicism and apparent in many other examples of torture, both real and fictional to this day, in which the ordeal of torture is intensified by its orderliness and formality. A very famous 20th century example would be Kafka's In the Penal Colony, where the torture is completed when the actual art process of the tattooing of the criminal's sins on his body is completed. In the case of Monsieur Valdemar, the experiment on a dying man to see perhaps if consciousness survives death is conducted by a mesmerist whose entire practice is ritualistic, occurring at the uneasy frontier between science and superstition. And in two of Poe's most strikingly Gothic tales, The Masque of the Red Death and The Fall of the House of Usher, the locations, Usher's great pile and the palace of Prince Prospero, seem invested in their very fabric with a sense of the enactment of rites. The worlds of these two stories conduct a perpetual funeral for the future. In this sense, Poe's story worlds function of invocations of the powers that will destroy some of their central characters, or as verbal altars on which imaginative sacrifice is performed. This degree of what you might call through composition, with its tendency to confer agency on the texture and symbolism of the work itself, is perhaps more immediately characteristic of poetry than prose. Dickens, a contemporary of Poe's, likewise lends himself to this kind of totalizing reading, and his work, like Poe's, might seem to have anticipated the appetites of later criticism and theory. The completeness of a poem has as much to do with musical organization as with an avowed theme. Like other significant literary artists, such as Eliot and Yeats, Poe formed a theory. He commended brevity, unity, and compression, and perhaps also implied the displacement of familiar meaning by intensity of apprehension, and so sought to demonstrate the inescapable rightness of his own practice. And I suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that the surviving evidence of his tales bears out the wisdom of his methods and the durability and originality of his art. Thank you.